Welcome, fellow Kruelboyz, to the tricksy swamps of the mortal realms, because today we are talking about a few of the sub-factions for the Kruelboyz. This is the newest army, or I guess you could say sub-faction itself, to enter the fight for the mortal realms. Now, for those of you who are new to Age of Sigmar or the Orc War Clans faction in general, the Kruelboyz are a new iteration of the Orc race that has become a massive force in this next chapter of Age of Sigmar. They are, of course, as you'd expect, orcs, but they are a bit different. They're like a subspecies within that category. They tend to be much taller and leaner and really stress the elements of Mork. So Mork being one of the two gods within the greenskin culture. There's Gork and Mork. Mork represents that idea of like cunning and guile and tricksiness or indirect combat over a straight up brawl. But don't let that mistake you. They love to fight, but their joy in battle is much more of a slow burn, right? Where the Ironjaws or the Bone Splitters, they see an enemy, they get excited, and they just start running towards it. The Kruelboyz find their joy in stalking their prey, creating elaborate traps, disorienting them, and just generally toying with their kill before they go in for that final strike. Now, when I say tricksy, it's not in the way of Tzeentch, right, with these grand designs and machinations, but rather, it's like a predator toying with their food. It's entertainment, but it's not part of some grandiose plot to undo, reality and stuff like that. But more so than just being, tricksy orcs, there's more going on, of course, because this is the faction that we got to meet along with our heroes. I still think they rank as one of the coolest enemy introductions ever in Black Library history. So if you haven't seen it, the book Dominion by, I believe it's Darius Hanks, he basically lays out what this third chapter of Age of Sigmar is going to be about. We're introduced to the Kruelboyz, how they fight, and it's so fascinating to get a glimpse because, we're following the humans' perspective of all this, and so you kind of get this one-of-a-kind, point of view shot of how the cities of Sigmar and Stormcast Eternals, they just can't seem to understand this new foe. This foe that uses misdirection and divides the enemy. They use hallucinations and traps and maddening cackles of laughter, poison, animal stampedes, and more. That's just a few of the things that are in this book. But what's interesting is that all of that we see and we learn and get creeped out by in Dominion is just kind of like the baseline for their kind. But even among the far-reaching tribes of Kruelboyz, 3 stand out as being the cruelest of the cruel, who have set themselves apart with triumphs and infamy among the mortal realms. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to dig into the 3 sub-factions of Kruelboyz. Now we're going to start that discussion with the Grinning Blades. And honestly, to me, the Grinning Blades are sort of like the shining example of what it means to be a Kruelboy, right? Like when you read their lore segment in the Battle Tome, it's just like, all that stuff we said about Kruelboyz? Let's turn it up to 11, right? I mean, and every faction has a sub-faction that's like this where, it's like Ultramarines to Space Marines. They just exemplify the best parts of that army that they're a part of. The standard, if you will. Their shamans are some of the best seers. They use things like fog and misdirection and cover like masters. They can produce these miasmas that fog, all kinds of cities and poisonous gases, and they have shaman magics and can turn whole regions into swamp and choke the life out of a city with it. As a tribe, they originated in Gur and lived in the shadow of civilization for quite some time. One of the things that saw them rise to such prominence, though, like what sets them apart from other Kruelboyz, is their use of glimmerings. So if you're not familiar with what that is, these are basically the magic-infused rock that can be found in the city of Excelsius. It's a main plot point for a lot of things that happen there. It's like a resource that gives you the ability to see into this future and scry portents and things like that. Well, you can imagine how that kind of a resource in the hands of a group of orcs that have exceptional shaman would be quite a boon. Their seers have these grand visions of a war yet to come, where the forces of destruction will wash the realms clear of any opposition and plunge everything into a wild state of primal anarchy. There's actually a great story about their former boss who ran this war clan named Borguk the Sly, who was basically an insanely, OP BA leader. He's super cunning, super dangerous. He was a great leader for the war clan. But one day, Gobsprak, who we've talked about before in a previous video, I'll try to remember to leave a link to that in the description below, but Gobsprak rolls up to the Grinning Blades, and rather than challenging Gobsprak for leadership, Borguk the Sly just kind of like excuses himself, and he's just like, lets Gobsprak take command. Now, like I said, I have a whole video about Gobsprak, but the reason I bring that story up now is because I mentioned in the Gobsprak video, he has this aura about him where orcs just know this dude is important, right? And this is what I'm talking about, is they had a great leader who was super aggressive, super sly, and the minute Gobsprak shows up, he's like, "I will be adjourned, sir," and steps away from the leader's table. And this is incredible because they already had some of the best shamans in the Kruelboy faction, and Gobsprak showing up only adds to that power, because now they have some of the most powerful seers in the realms, and much to the detriment of civilization, they have firmly allied themselves with Kragnos. Again, I went over that in the Gobsprak video as well. But essentially, he acts as the translator for Kragnos, and the Grinning Blades have become sort of a personal army for him. Of course, not everything they do is related to Kragnos, but that is kind of where they firmly lie, is that they are sort of like the chosen warband of Gobsprak, who is sort of the mouth of Kragnos, and so they will be working together quite a bit in the future. And so the Grinning Blades have become a staple of this, triumvirate of destruction of Kragnos, Gobsprak, and Kruelboyz. And so when it comes to planning the day where destruction will rise in mass, they kind of have all of the tools they need in the toolbox to do so. Now, the second subfaction of Kruelboyz is known as the Big Yellers, and from a lore perspective, these boys are my favorite. A few things really make them stand out. Firstly, they prefer to be loud and overwhelming to sneaky and unseen, right? And so, which may sound odd for a Kruelboy, because everything you've read so far paints them as being kind of these tricksy, hide in the shadows, use camouflage kind of orcs. But in truth, they aren't sneaky, they are tricky, which is different, right? So if your shaman brews a potent batch of hallucinogenic miasma, they do that a lot. No matter what tribe you're in, they do that. And then you roll up with a deafening sound of monsters and orcs and captives. You have bright lights, maybe a few tricks to make it seem like you have more troops than you do. That show of force and bravado mixed with people under the influence of things where they're already having psychedelic trips, you can really mess with defenders. Even in the mortal realms, the key to life is acting like you have confidence, right? It's just, you got this. And so they roll up making as much sound and noise and fury, and it just absolutely drives people mad. Secondly, and this kind of ties into the third one as well, they are the laziest of the Kruelboyz, which is something that I firmly respect. But from that laziness, they've turned to, big brain energy to make their lives easier. Their fortresses will have pulleys and cranks and rope networks, any tools or hacks that they can pillage or come up with to do less physical work. They've even orcified a looted cog fort to act as a more comfortable home than just the straight up woods. But lastly, and again, as part of their laziness, they are the best shots in the Kruelboyz arsenal. And what I mean is they love to produce, use, and excel at firing crossbow weapons, like the Man Skewer Bolt Boys or the Beast Skewer Killbow. So you have this faction of snipers, right? Not because it's the best, but because they just want to do the least amount of work, which, again, super respect. But I find them interesting when you put this all together, because let's say you are a city that's being besieged by these guys. So you're a small town, maybe an outpost or a fortification that's just trying to survive. And you can have lots of noise, both visual, auditory. There's probably some, weird, trippy side effect going on because, of course, they're Kruelboyz. They poison everything. There's miasma, hallucinogenics, psychoactive things. Maybe the defenders can't actually figure out where they're being attacked from, because every time they peek over the wall, they take an arrow to the head, right? And so you're just kind of hiding, cowering, and you're hearing so much noise, and it's just absolutely grating. And the second you try to get a real sense of what's going on, you poke your head up, somebody gets killed. And lastly are the Skullbugs, a war clan that has set up their home in Shyish, particularly the underworld of Chitnia, a afterlife formed by people who exalted insects and creepy crawlies as deity, or at least godlike. Well, at some point, these Kruelboyz rolled in. The shamans purged all the spirits there, so they have their own, they took over somebody else's Valhalla, basically. And they got to work bringing the insects and the beasts and the monsters of the realm under their control. And so first and foremost, these are Kruelboyz defined by their use of monsters and anything really that they can strap a mount to or howdah to. They want to be in control of their environment by using the beasts of that environment. But what's equally interesting is that they're also masters of potions and poisons. And normally you'd think oh yeah, you put a poison on an arrowhead or a spear tip. If they have, spiders in their arsenal, of course, they have access to all kinds of cool poisons and stuff. Not so much. You see, instead of using these things as weapons, they load all the animals that they have quote-unquote domesticated up with all of these concoctions to elevate them from a scary beast into a living war machine. So it's just kind of like the old Batman movie where they just pump Bane full of drugs and all of a sudden he becomes like a superhero. Not superhero, he's a super criminal, but you know what I mean? It's that same thing where they're just injecting it with, performance enhancing poisons into their beast who just become absolute wrecking balls. I kind of view these as the Spider Fang equivalent of the Kruelboyz. Their fascination of insects is very off-putting to others of their war clans, so other Kruelboyz don't really like them. They kind of see them as weirdos. But for the Skullbugs, their home is nothing more than a paradise full of incredible life, ready to be formed into a weapon by their tricks and their shamans and their all kinds of stuff like that. So I want to end this video, like I end all my videos, talking about why is this so cool. Okay, in this point, I love the fact that the Kruelboyz subfactions, they really do point out all the different forms of being cunning, right? You have poisons, you have shamans, you have shooting, you have using animals and beasts of burden rather than just running up with your fist. But they also show a very adaptable race, okay? So you have the Grinning Blades are easily able to change to new power structures, which is a unique thing. They just understand intrinsically who needs to be leading, which is kind of a huge deal for orcs because they oftentimes can just collapse as a faction once the hero is dead. But if you have people who can understand, the chain of command and kind of rally around that makes them incredibly dangerous, especially when the person at the top is someone as brutal as Kragnos or Gobsprak. It's just awesome. For the big yellers, they have evolved to be cunning by the use of technology. Not only do they have their whole being big and scary versus, stealthy and creepy, but just the fact that they are able to use human technology against us in terms of pulleys and tools and looted cog forts, that's a huge thing. And lastly, with the Skullbugs, just using the natural environment around them to give them the greatest edge. With the monsters and stuff like that they are able to tame and control and infuse with all kinds of invigorating stuff. It doesn't matter if the animals die after the battle. During that battle, they are each a Hulk, which is kind of the point. And I would like to ask you, which of these three is your favorite? I'm going to be honest, mine is the Big Yellers. I love the idea of a faction just being as loud as they can. There's just something about that intimidation factor where it's you're probably already messed up. They probably already poisoned the water. You're all seeing things, having a rough time. Nobody's sleeping. And then just to have a cacophony of sound and color and screaming constantly. And you can't even poke your head up to see where it's coming from because they'll get you. And they're able to snipe out leadership, which will of course further, lead to paranoia and dissent. It just sounds like they are a predator who has keyed into a way to hunt humanity. And I think that's so cool. But I want to hear yours. Tell me in the comments down below which of these sounds the most interesting, and we will continue the conversation there. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Happy wargaming.